Hello, my friends, and welcome once again to Kardec Radio. It's Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and here we are, Spiritism, a closer look. I'm Luiz Lima, and I'm talking to you directly from Florida. Yeah, it's warm here, as always. Tonight, we are going to have a very special program. We are going to take a closer look at something that we could call something like this: when Spiritism meets science. That's a little bit of a challenge, right? Because they are apparently, at least for most people, they are opposing sides. Not necessarily, though. And to talk to us about that, I'm gonna call somebody who's gonna be able to clarify everything for us. So here he is, Marco Magalhães. Marco, welcome.
Hello, hello. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you for accepting the invitation for such at least for me, such an interesting and challenging topic. When Spiritism meets science, have they met? By the way, have they met?
Yeah, I think they met from day one, because the reality is that we're the entire concept of spiritism, like how it's created, it was really based on a very organized method that Kardec created to go through all this information that was coming through the spirits, and then organizing it, categorizing it, and put it out into paper and publishing it. So the reality is that we're literally inseparable from it, and as Kardec says, right, it's actually part of who we are.
And even after Kardec, there's a lot of additional Spiritist literature, and it goes, I would say, deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think a lot of the works that we have that kind of combine spiritism and science, we could not understand fully in the past because science had not reached the point that would allow us to grasp what's written in there. So it's something that goes together. They go together. Science has to advance for us to understand, and so and so and so. So
Absolutely, yeah. And if you think about it, Kardec started. When Kardec started, basically, none of what we understand today, spiritism, like with the knowledge, was just not there, right? So he had to start this new concepts, and information was coming from everywhere, right? And you have all these events happening in Paris at the time around the world, and just the mindset of trying to get the truth and the real information out of that phenomenon, right? And make into something that people could understand, right? Which is logical, which is tested, right? Like, for example, he was matching information from different sources, right, to support some of the ideas and some of the answers, right? That was incredibly well organized. And then, as you said, like moving from there, even on Kardec's work, there's this interesting progression. For example, if you look at the book Genesis, right, where we introduce concepts of the creation of the universe, which are unheard of in some cases, right? So we're kind of playing catch, as you said, right?
right.
It is quite incredible, right?
Yeah, you mentioned the book of Genesis. One of the, I think, one of the parts in the book that I just keep coming back to 1869 or 68. And I said,
Yeah.
what is this guy thinking when he wrote about fluids? It's just unbelievable. I mean, we had no knowledge whatsoever, academically speaking,
Yeah.
of how to research this, how to know these things. However, he goes in there and puts a full blown chapter, very detailed, about fluids, and I go like, how is it? It's incredible. It gives me chills when I
Yeah.
think about it.
And if you, it's interesting because in history, like in '68, we're having civil rights movement in the states, right? So that was the proclamation of the 14th Amendment, and then you have and then you have for example, in Canada, we actually became Canada at that time, right? Because that's when the Confederation gives rise to what we know as Canada today. So there's all these changes, right, happening, right, in science too. So it's almost like the entire world is kind of being prepared, right?
Hmm.
For this incredible amount of knowledge. And fluids, obviously, it's something critical, but like not only that, you think about things that definition of God, for example, right, or the universe or matter, like how the spiritual world interacts with matter, which is I think we're still learning that, right? So, for example, how the law of gravity is important in any aspect of creation, but not only that, how we as a spiritual world, right, or the spiritual principle, right, progresses through together with the world. And I mean, it's it's really, and I still think we don't understand fully like what he brought to us, right?
Yeah,
The
not
idea
yet.
of the universal cosmic fluid. How can he create the material principle?
Mhm.
How the vital principle, is used to animate things, and then, and the spiritual principle as this separate part of the creation which evolves with it, like, and it's, as you said, is I think we're still grasping that idea realistically. I don't think we can fully understand, even going back to Kardec. And then I'm not even talking about what Andrea Louise is writing, right, and what
More
she could brought
complicated.
to us. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think Andre Louise, he addresses something that, of course, Allan Kardec didn't have time to write everything he could. But I think the focus, when it comes to spiritism and science, I think the focus on Andre Louise is the ability that we gain by reading and understanding diseases, how diseases come about, which is a totally, it makes us walk away from the plain, straight, materialistic point of view where cells, mutate and do this and that. There's a lot more going on. So I think it's really layer number two. Kardec is layer one, and on top of that, André Luis comes up and gives us all of that, which again we are not able to fully understand everything, but I think a lot of it we are able now because science discovered things that we go back to the original text and there's a match here.
Yeah.
So
It's interesting that you bring that up, because, and I even think, even if you look at Andrea Louis' work, it's also done in this progressive, increased amount of complexity and knowledge delivered, right? Both on the spiritual, emotional perspective, the psychological perspective, and then the scientific evidence behind it. Um, so obviously, if you think about, like the fact that he's bringing us concepts of like an iPad, like a tablet, right, that can connect and project images, and like, the go like it as a, apparatus that can look into our thoughts and minds, and
mhm,
so all those things that now for us is more like, oh, I kind of know what you're talking about, right?
right.
um and then, like, all the way to evolution to worlds, but really, like, that's that it's like this you throwing this big wrench in this whole concept of, you know who we are, right? It's like going back to, it's almost like thinking, like, wait a minute, like, your evolution is intertwined, right? Your spiritual body is critical to define who you are, and disease, and, and I think, like, evolution to worlds, for me, I think it's literally a masterpiece of understanding who we are,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, interestingly, just a side note here. When I started going to spiritist centers, I went like most people, let me just go to see what they have to say, very like skeptical about it. And then somebody was lecturing on something that I don't quite remember the subject, but he
Mhm.
mentioned this is in details in this book, Evolution in Two Worlds. And I said, well, I really like what he said. Let me get this book and just take a quick look at it. So that was the first spiritist book that I read
Wow.
before codification and everything else because I couldn't stop. Of course, you don't understand everything on the first shot, but what's being said, the subject, the concepts, I couldn't stop reading. So I read the whole thing, and of course, then I got to go back to the basics. But that was really my first spiritist book. that I.
That is quite a journey, eh? Because I mean, I have to admit, I mean, I probably read that book now. I lost count, probably like 5 times or more.
uh,
But it is not a, yeah. But I can see how a scientific mindset will be like glued into that, to that book, right?
Yeah,
Because
I
that's,
couldn't stop. Yeah, it's still probably possibly the book that I use most for preparing lectures and for self knowledge. So if you read 5 times, maybe I read it 10 times.
yeah,
But
exactly.
and I can't stop. It's just and every time you get more out of it. Every time, it's
Yeah.
unbelievable. And so you were talking. It just came to mind. You were talking about God in the beginning. Definition of God and the creation. A lot of times what we hear from, especially from people coming into spiritism, people who are new to it or even don't know anything about it, they're just curious. It looks to me, I might be wrong, but it looks to me, seems to me that a lot of people expect that science is gonna find God and tell so we are, oh yeah, we are kind of waiting for that day. And I usually tell people, you got to understand that's not the purpose of science. That's out of their league. That's I mean, they're not running towards that goal. So it cannot be, should not be something that we expect, right? You agree
Yeah.
with that?
No, I completely agree, and I think, I mean, historically speaking, the whole separation of religion and science obviously um, has been evolving, right, through the religion over time, and
Mhm.
society and culture and politics, and there's so many factors, right, that contribute to that, almost like a segregation, right, of those two. But the truth reality is that, they're different things, but they're connected, right? And they really shouldn't be, trying to kind of go against each other. It's like, I'm going to prove you wrong, or you're wrong, or that wrong, right? And I think that concept, unfortunately, has set us back several thousand years, probably, in the way we can kind of understand things, right? And you're right, like science is really an application of a method to address a question, right? That's what science is. Now, certain questions we don't have the methods available to test. Like, it doesn't mean that they're not true, or they're true or not. It really means that we don't have the capacity yet to address those questions. And I mean, it's interesting because I'm a trained scientist, right? So I spent many years, both through grad school and then postdoc, and now I'm a professor at the University of Toronto, and I run a research lab on cancer research. And I have several funded projects nowadays that look into, understanding mechanism of disease. Basically, that's what my lab mostly does.
Mhm.
And when I look into the literature in Spiritism, right? For example, in Evolution to Worlds, and Andrea Luiz brings the concept of the mechanism of disease from a spiritual perspective. It is really quite amazing because it opens my mind to a level that I would probably not be able to, right, if I didn't have that background, right? Or like one example, for example, when you think about the perispirit being directly connected to every single one of our cells in our body, as Andrea Luiz presents, right?
Right.
In other words, it gives us this incredible connection, right? Like cell to cell for
Mhm.
every single part of a perispiritual body and our spirit. And the way he explains that the severing, or the discohesion, the disconnection of that link, is where you start to develop a disease process in that cell, is quite remarkable, because literally a cell is organized and is directed by the environment, right? So
Right.
you can put cells in different environments, you can apply different chemicals and forces, and the cell will basically react, right, to that environment, and it will adapt or will do things. And if you think about that, there's one perspective that we can't not test, right, in a petri dish, right, is how this other layer of connection, right, of the perispirit and the influence of the perispirit in the machinery of the cell is actually critical to keep that cell functioning, right?
Yeah.
And the first time I read it, and I really probably spent like hours just on that single line, right, just just kind of picturing this, right? They say, I have all these cells in my petri dish, and I'm doing all these chemicals, I'm forcing the cells to go through matrix and do this and all of that thing, and I'm putting drugs on that, and we can't really bring exactly the same environment. We try as much as we can, but we can't replicate the full environment of a functional human body in vitro, right? We do it. Well, I think science has evolved a lot in that, but it's, to me now, it's pretty obvious, right? Because we don't have that same spiritual envelope, right? That makes that cell meaningful to a spirit and to existence, right? So I think, obviously I can talk, I can probably talk hours about this, but I think that concept alone, like, I think is so transformational for us to understand, because it also gives us the ability of thinking, understanding healing, right? The healing process, right? Or why do we have diseases, right? Or like, what is a disease other than a process that would allow us maybe to get rid of some of the things that we've been carrying, or to improve, or to change. So I think it opened up this incredible possibility, right?
Yeah, one of the things that for me was a I would say a milestone in my studies and in the process here was when I got to know what, because I'm not from the medical field, I'm an engineer, but I'm very interested in it. I read about it. So one day I came across epigenetics, and I said, well, let me dig into this thing a little bit more. So I read a lot and I became fascinated. And then I said, now I got to go back to Evolution in Two Worlds and read it again, because I have another layer of knowledge, completely different. So I
Exactly.
read it again with that in mind. And then I said, I need to research a little bit more about epigenetics. So then I figured, then I learned that we started looking at it as a possibility in 1966, and nothing came out of it until maybe the late 80s, in terms of something more believable, I
Yeah.
would say. So it's 20 years went by, and Andre Luiz has been telling us since the 40s.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a milestone when I was able to put the two things together, and it gave me a different perspective on, like you said, diseases and everything else.
Yeah.
So
No, I think that's a great example, because epigenetics now, obviously, there's an entire field of research dedicated to it. I have many colleagues that work specifically on it, but pretty much every single one of us in research, particularly when we're studying diseases, like in my lab, we're trying to understand factors that can mediate changes to the cell, right? And like regulation of gene expression, for example, and epigenetics. Obviously, now we know, right, how critical that is, right?
yeah,
And not only that, for example, in my research, we look at how different cells can and communicate and interact with each other, like creating environments that will shift the way a cell behave, right? Even without any other genetic changes, right? And those little things, as you said, they're pretty much all contained in Evolution Two Worlds, right? Because Andrea Luis is talking about, for example, how this it's almost like comparing our body into a factory, right? Where you have all this little individualized systems, the cells that are working together, but need to be in sync, right? They need to be communicating effectively, right? They need to be directed, right, by we as we are as a spirit, and that unison of work, right, is literally what health it is, right? So that's how it is. But not only that, like Jean-Louis brings even more perspectives. For example, when he's mentioned that the antidote to some of these diseases is like things like humility and
yeah,
charity, right? And behavior and mind, like what are you thinking? And now this is really like, we're changing completely the narrative from like, you have as you said, like you have this cell that express A, B, and C, therefore this cell is a bad cell, and that's what we used to think, in the 60s, 50s, right? And now we're thinking about, well, wait a minute, there's a lot of things that not necessarily the gene expression that are now telling what the cell what to do, including other cells. So now it's like a multiple complex system, right? And then Andrea Luiz is still like 100 years ahead of us, because saying that no, not only that, there's like the spirit and the perispirit, and there's your thoughts and your behavior and your actions, and then probably there's more. It's just that
Yeah.
we're probably not even ready to understand all of it yet, right?
Yeah, no, and it goes. This goes for month and month. It's a long talk. Yeah, we could be talking here for month, but I think one of the things that I like to explain and discuss when I'm talking to spiritists is the idea that the generative diseases, they have two factors that have to come together: intrinsic and triggering factors. Intrinsic means something that is in my DNA. It's part of my DNA. It's the body. Hormones will have different levels as you age, stuff like that. So we think we don't control those. So let's just say for now, we don't control those. So that's intrinsic. And triggering factors are things that will make the cells respond to a negative energy. So basically, they are vices. And that's a common sense throughout medicine and spiritualism and everything else.
Yeah.
So triggering factors are vices. So I ask the people, how much percent do you think we are responsible for the triggering factors? And everybody kind of agrees that it's 100%. I'm 100% responsible for these triggering factors. Then I go to the other side. Okay, let's go back to intrinsics. How much am I responsible for my genetics? And usually people say, it's my mother and my father. And I say, oh, okay, all right. Now let me ask you the next question. Why do I have the genetics that I have? Because of my spiritual history. I had to come with certain genetic possibilities, to say the least,
Yeah.
to go through this particular lifetime. So the reason why I have the genetics that I have is because of my spiritual history. So how much am I responsible for it? 100%.
100.
So
Yes.
how much am I responsible for the generative diseases?
Yeah.
Plain 100%. And that's an interesting perspective that, when you read André Luiz, the whole
Yeah.
works of André Luiz, you get that clearly. It's very interesting. It was
Yeah.
for me, at least.
No, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's just, well, I think it's spiritism as a whole, right? And not only this scientific adventure looking at what we're doing now, but also the entire concept since the introduction of the spirits book is basically telling us that we are really responsible for our actions. I mean, it sounds like something completely silly sometimes to be saying this, but it is so important, right? Because
Yes.
I think for thousands of years, when we incarnated here before, we're living in these scenarios where, like, maybe I'm not 100% responsible for what I do. I always blame things, and I do this, and I excuse myself, and I kind of wiggle here and there, right? And
Right.
I do all these things that, and then we create this narrative, right? That this is fine, this is acceptable, I'm doing the right thing, right? Now we're like looping back into all of that and pointing the big finger at the mirror, right? And say, hey, wait a minute, right? It's you, buddy, right? You got to deal with this. This is your action. There is a reaction. You're going to take it. You can make it, but now alleviates it too, right? Because oh, wait a minute, but you can do it better, easier. You can make it things, more doable, right? It's not that this eternal punishment idea, but rather than that, it's like, the faster you do it and the more you put your heart into it, the easier it gets with time, right? And diseases are just, as you said, is a perfect example of that. Because the reality is, a lot of the disease process is actually part of the cure, right? If you think
Right.
about it, like the disease is not, it's only one step towards the real cure, right? And
Right.
also plays in our minds, because we still nowadays, in even in spiritism and other religions too, is still trying to find that miraculous cure, right? As kind of, this is the way to go. And I think if we deserve it, we'll get it. I'm not questioning that, right? I think cures happen. They have their place, and some people definitely deserve it, and they'll definitely get it, right? But this is not the norm, right? It's not like I want to get rid of this, right? And I think if everyone reads André Luiz, will definitely understand that that may not be, we may be playing exactly the same card that we played through generations, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about it, but I think about it all the
No,
time.
I do. And you brought me something came to mind now. We want things in a snap of fingers.
Yeah,
I want to get rid of this disease. But that's it. I want to be done.
yeah,
And I think this is a kind of a thought that comes from many, many, many lives under the same biblical, you know, view, where if you go back to the Bible and you interpret the Genesis, Mosaic Genesis, literally, God is very immediatist. Everything
mhm,
happens as a snap of fingers. It's creationism, right? So
yeah,
God does this, it rains. God does this, there's thunder. God does this. So this is a very immediatist interpretation of the creation.
mhm,
So we want diseases to do the same way. At the best, at the best, we are on our second incarnation after Spiritism. At the best, most of us are on the
yeah,
first.
yeah,
So we're still bringing all of that energy, all of these things from biblical times, hearing and studying and believing the same thing all the time. So we are still living by the snap of fingers
for sure.
possibilities. And like you said, that's not the way it is. A disease, just like you said, it's vices being flushed out. So
Yeah,
no snap of fingers,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, and I mean, I think, and one of the so I tend to talk a lot about disease, I guess, because of my training, right, and background, and
Yeah,
obviously my
you're
interest.
you're a dentist, so you're in the medical
Yeah,
profession.
yeah, and as a cancer researcher, obviously we all want to find a cure, right?
Uh-huh.
Obviously we do everything we can, right, to basically understand the process so we can target it, right? And then the more I study it, right, the more I kind of apply the spiritist concepts to it. I think, let's put
Mhm.
it this way, right? And it does make a difference, right? Not only the fact that I'm actually managing patients with cancer in my clinic in the hospital, and I see it on a very close basis, on my research and people close to me. This is a disease that affects about one in two individuals at some point is going to have some sort of disease, cancer, and then 1 in 4 in Canada will actually die of it. So 1 in 5. So it is quite devastating. And I think if you think carefully about what cancer is, for example, which is as a basic definition, let's say, like obviously it's a lot more complex than this, right? It is an uncontrolled growth of a group of cells that eventually spreads and destroy things around and go to other
Right.
places and causes damage to who we are as a physical body. So if you think about that, that is really tied into what we just talked about of regulation of the perispiritual body, and like how we control ourselves, but also gives this window of opportunity, which is basically saying, hey, I can actually make things to alleviate this, right?
Yeah.
Or I can maybe prevent this, not only as obvious preventive measures, like for example, applying sunscreen or like not smoking, right? Things that are obvious, because this is self-inflicted damage, right? So this is
Right.
something that we're creating. But only that, like also in our minds and attitudes, right? That's what Luis saying. So constant goodness generates constant goodness, right? It's a simple perspective, but I think it gives us this power in spiritism of looking at both the spiritual side and the physical side and working them together, right?
And that's how Spiritism and Science met.
Exactly. Yeah.
Marco, it's been a pleasure having you here with us, explaining detailing all these little things, and putting your perspective on it. If you're listening to us here, you can always request new topics for us to discuss. You can always go to cardiacradio.com and our Facebook page. You can see it down on the screen to ask for topics and discussions for us. Marco, we gotta close. Unfortunately, like you said, this
Thank
is
you
a
so much.
discussion for several days, maybe a month. But
Yeah.
any final words you want to leave for us?
No, first of all, thank you for being here. I think it was a great conversation, and I'm happy to discuss any science, religion, spiritist topics at any time. But most important, I think for whoever is watching is I just want to make sure people, get the basics. Like, in the basics is, like, we are this composite system of spirit, perispirit, body, and if we want to be healthy, we're gonna work on all the layers of it, and we got to really start from, like, who we are, right? That's really where that all starts, basically.
Beautiful. All right. Thank you very much. And if you're watching us right now, we will be here next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern with another topic. Thank you very much and be well.